Miller family lives on a small farm, where John, the father, and Sarah, the mother, work hard to cultivate their cornfields. The teenage son, Ethan, admires his parents but is uneasy about an old scarecrow standing in the backyard, who watches him with an uncomfortable smile. The family routine is marked by collaboration in daily tasks, where they share meals and laughs at dusk. However, as the daylight fades, Ethan cannot ignore the feeling that the scarecrow is becoming increasingly sinister. The Miller family's cornfield was a vast expanse of greenery that stretched as far as the eye could see, but there was one point that always bothered Ethan: the scarecrow standing in the corner of the field under an old oak. Made of torn clothes and filled with straw, it had a grotesque appearance, as if it was more alive than inanimate. The dark button eyes, fixed in a crooked smile, seemed to follow Ethan every step he took. The stories about the scarecrow were part of local tradition. The neighbors used to whisper about how he had been raised to protect crops, but Ethan always felt there was something more. To him, the scarecrow was not just a protector of the farm. It was a keeper of dark secrets, a symbol of something that could not be explained. One afternoon, while working in the field, Ethan took a step away from the routine and approached the scarecrow. He observed the details of the sewn face, and a feeling of fear enveloped him. The wind blew, causing the scarecrow's arms to shake in a disturbing way, as if he was waving. Ethan's heart sped, and he quickly moved away, looking over his shoulder as if he expected to see the scarecrow move. "It's just a piece of cloth and straw," he muttered to himself, trying to convince himself. But the truth is, the more time he spent on that farm, the stronger his aversion to the scarecrow became. He never mentioned his fears to his parents, afraid of being considered a coward. That night, as the family gathered for dinner, the conversation flowed naturally, but Ethan was distant. He could not get the scarecrow out of his mind. The image of him swaying in the wind haunted him. As soon as the sun went down, a feeling of apprehension settled in his chest. He knew that the scarecrow was out there under the darkness. After a quiet meal, he asked permission to go to sleep. His parents agreed, but he did not go straight to the room. He stood at the window in the corridor, peeking out. And there was the scarecrow standing in the field, his silhouette standing out against the night. Ethan frowned and suddenly saw something that made his heart stop. The scarecrow moved. Ethan was paralyzed in the window, his eyes wide in disbelief as the scarecrow moved slowly, as if stretching out after a long day standing. The feeling of terror enveloped him, and he could barely breathe. It was not just the image of the scarecrow, but the certainty that he was no longer in the same place where he had been left. With a sudden impulse, Ethan ran into the room and closed the door behind him, locking it with fervor. He threw himself into bed, his heart beating wildly. The shadows danced on the walls as the moonlight filtered through the window, but he could not take his eyes off where he believed the scarecrow was still. In the middle of panic, he tried to convince himself that everything was only his imagination. "It is just a scarecrow. Can't do anything." But his mind kept repeating the image of the scarecrow, the crooked expression of the smile that followed him. He covered himself with the blanket, as if it could protect his body from the sinister presence that he imagined lurking. The minutes dragged on like hours. The farm was silent, except for the sound of the wind blowing outside. Ethan heard the crickets singing and the rustling of the leaves, but in his mind there was another sound. A whisper, a distant voice that seemed to call him. He forced himself to listen, but all he caught was the deep silence of the night. Finally, his curiosity overcame the fear. With a hesitant movement, he got up from his bed and walked to the window, peeking out. The scarecrow was now back in the yard, but something was different. He seemed to be closer to the house, his silhouette dimly lit by the moonbeams. "Ethan?" The soft voice of his mother cut off the silence, making him jump. Sarah was on the other side of the door, worried. "Is that all right, baby?" "Yes, I'm just a little scared," Ethan replied, trying to hide the truth from his feelings. "Don't worry, you're safe here. The scarecrow is just a doll," she said, trying to comfort him. "Get back in bed, my love." He nodded, but his mind was far away. As soon as his mother walked away, Ethan felt that he could not sleep. The scarecrow looked like a specter, a living entity that watched him. With a deep sigh, he decided he needed to confront his fear. Taking courage, he left the room and went to the front door, hesitating before opening. A cold chill invaded the house, and he felt the country breeze on his face. The sky was clear, with stars shining brightly, but the presence of the scarecrow made him uneasy. He walked cautiously into the yard, determined to face what he feared. When he came close to the cornfield, he saw the scarecrow standing in his usual position, but an unexpected movement caught his attention. A shadow moved behind the scarecrow, and he stopped, heart in throat. Ethan didn't know if he should run or stay. Before I could decide, the shadow became a more defined form. With his chest racing, he finally whispered, "Scarecrow, you can't hurt me." His voice trembled, but the bravery drove him to face the unknown. The answer came in the form of a soft whisper, almost like a breeze. "Why do you fear me?" The question echoed in Ethan's mind as a distant lament. He was paralyzed, not knowing if what he had just heard was real or the fruit of his imagination. The Scarecrow, standing under the moonlight, looked more like a ghost than a simple straw doll. His button eyes reflected the light in a disturbing way, as if he was really alive. "Why do you fear me?" The whispered voice repeated itself, now clearer. The feeling of fear that involved Ethan turned into a disturbing confusion. The Scarecrow did not seem hostile. His question sounded curious, even melancholic. Ethan didn't know how to respond. He looked around, waiting for someone to come and help him, but the only company he had was the darkness that surrounded him. He felt an urge to run back home, but curiosity kept him in place. You moved," he stammered, still not knowing what to think. "Yes," the Scarecrow replied, his voice soft and ethereal. "Just as you move in your heart, even when you are afraid." The strangeness of the words made the boy hesitate. The Scarecrow, however bizarre it seemed to understand his feelings. He remembered times when he was afraid, when he felt vulnerable and insecure. "Why are you here?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling but determined. "Shouldn't you be in the cornfield?" "I am a guardian, a reminder of something you don't understand. You fear the unknown, but what you see is not always what it seems." Ethan frowned, confused. What did the Scarecrow mean? He looked at the surrounding fields, wondering what secrets might be hidden under the surface of the farm. The fear began to turn into a new emotion, a kind of curiosity that drove him to want to understand more. Before I could formulate an answer, a strong wind blew through the field, causing the Scarecrow to swing. Ethan shuddered, but the voice of the Scarecrow continued, "Follow me. What you fear may be revealing." With his heart beating fast, Ethan hesitated for a moment. Logic told him that he should go home, lock himself under the covers and forget all this. But something inside him pulled him forward, as if the Scarecrow had a deep knowledge that he wanted to discover. As he stepped toward the Scarecrow, he felt the fear wither away, replaced by a strange determination. The Scarecrow began to move slowly towards the cornfield, and Ethan followed him, feeling like a sleepwalker walking in a dream. As he approached, Ethan noticed that the darkness around him seemed to intensify, as if the shadows were gathering to observe. He turned one last time to the house, where the lights were out, and a feeling of loneliness enveloped him. His parents were asleep, oblivious to what was about to happen. "Come on, don't be afraid," the Scarecrow whispered, and in a dash of courage Ethan followed him into the heart of the cornfield, where the darkness grew thicker. Following the Scarecrow through the cornfield, Ethan felt that the world around him was changing. The corn ears swung softly with the wind, creating a whisper that seemed to intertwine with the voice of the Scarecrow. The darkness became more and more oppressive, and the boy wondered if he had made the right decision by following that peculiar figure. "You're getting close to the truth," the Scarecrow muttered, stopping in a small open space surrounded by rows of corn. Here, the line between what is real and what is imaginary dissolves. Ethan looked around, the moonlight barely illuminating space. There was a strange sense of tranquility, but also a shiver that ran through his spine. He felt the air thicker, as if something was about to happen. "What do you want to show me?" he asked, his voice echoing in the stillness of the night. "The fears you carry are not just yours. They are rooted in the land and the stories that the farm holds." The Scarecrow pointed with a worn arm towards the cornfield. "What you fear can become a light that lights the way to what you really need to understand." With his heart racing, Ethan turned in the direction indicated. As he looked closer, he noticed that the ground was slightly disturbed, as if something was buried there. He crouched, feeling the moisture of the earth under his fingers, and began to dig. As he dug, he found small objects, broken toys, old photos, and yellowed pieces of paper. Each item seemed to tell a story, a connection with lives that had passed through there. A sense of nostalgia enveloped him, but also a deep sadness. The cornfield was not just a field, it was a graveyard of memories. "These things belong to those who have forgotten how to dream," the Scarecrow said, now closer. "They feared what they didn't understand and let themselves be led by the shadows. You are at a crossroads, Ethan. Don't be fooled by fear." With a new determination, Ethan rose up, holding one of the broken toys. He remembered when he was younger, when he used to play happily, free of worries. "I don't want to be like that," he declared, his voice firm. "Then leave your fear behind," the Scarecrow replied. "You have the power to free yourself. But you must face it." A bang echoed in the cornfield, and the shadows around it began to shake. Ethan looked at the scarecrow, terror taking hold of him again. "What's going on?" "The time is coming," the scarecrow affirmed, his words charged with urgency. "You must choose between living in the shadows or facing what you fear." Ethan felt the increasing pressure on his chest. He remembered the stories his mother told about the scarecrow, how it protected the harvest and the family's lives. But now, that familiar figure seemed to represent something deeper. The choice he was about to make was more than just about him. It was about his own farm, its roots and the connection it had with his family. The darkness began to compress itself, and the voice of the scarecrow echoed in his mind. "Choose now, Ethan. What do you really want?" Ethan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He felt the weight of his insecurities, but also the hope that he could overcome them. With a last look at the scarecrow, he decided, "I want to be free from fear." Ethan's statement echoed in the cornfield, mixing with the wind that blew. As he uttered those words, a wave of clarity enveloped him. He realized that the scarecrow was not an evil being, but a guardian of his own anxieties, a manifestation of all he had feared. "Freedom from fear?" repeated the scarecrow, his voice now softer, as if in tune with what Ethan really felt. "Freedom does not come from denial, but from acceptance. Face what torments you." Ethan looked at the scarecrow, his mind seething with questions. "What do you represent? Why was I so afraid of you?" "I am what you made of me," the scarecrow replied, gesturing to the surrounding field. "I am the shadow of your fears, a reminder of the insecurities you have kept. But I am also a door to understanding. You can choose who I am and how I want to be treated." Ethan's perception began to change. The scarecrow, a figure he had feared so much, now looked like a symbol of endurance and wisdom. He realized that the memories he had unearthed were not just things of the past. They were parts of who he was, and he needed to face them in order to move on. "I want to understand," Ethan declared, feeling the weight of his words. "I want to understand what's behind my fear." The scarecrow smiled, the grotesque expression turning into something more human. "Then look around. What you see is not just the cornfield. It's the cycle of life, harvest and loss. Every fear you have is like a plant that needs to be cared for. Accept them, and you will see them blossom into something new." Ethan looked at the cornfield, realizing that each corn stalk represented not only his anxieties but also his hopes and dreams. He took a deep breath and felt the energy around him. The field, once threatening, now seemed to pulse with life as if it was waiting for him. Taking courage, he turned to the scarecrow. "I don't want you to be just a symbol of my fear. I want you to be part of my journey of growth." The scarecrow nodded, and a soft light began to shine around him, enveloping Ethan in a comforting warmth. So be it. What you fear will become your ally, and your journey of self-discovery can begin." As the light intensified, Ethan felt his insecurities dissolve, as if the cornfield was absorbing his fears. He felt lighter, as if a load had been removed from his shoulders. "The connection I had with the scarecrow was now different. It was a bond of understanding and acceptance." With a last look at the scarecrow, Ethan smiled. "Thank you for showing me the way." When the light finally dissipated, Ethan found himself back in his bed, as if everything was just a dream. The fear that had haunted him now seemed a distant memory. He stood up and looked out of the window where the cornfield shone in the morning light. He knew the journey was not over, but he was ready to face what came next. The scarecrow would still be there, but now it would be a part of his life that would represent not only fears, but also the courage to overcome them. With every step he took on the farm, confidence grew inside him. He smiled, looking out into the field. The family, the memories, and the scarecrow, all now part of his history. And as the sun rose, he realized that just like the cornfield, it could also bloom. The smell of wet earth and aged wood invaded Clara's nostrils as she crossed the rusty gate of Holloway Farm. The property, which had been vibrant with laughter and parties, now seemed a distant echo of what it was. The cold winds whispered through the trees, and a feeling of loneliness enveloped her like a heavy blanket. It was a cloudy day, and heavy clouds promised rain at any time. Clara stopped in front of the two-story house, where so many memories of her childhood were made. His grandfather, a man of firm voice and piercing eyes, used to tell stories about the farm, talking about his ancestors and how the earth carried secrets that should not be revealed. Now, these secrets became more than bedtime stories. They were a call that echoed in his mind. She took the rusty key from her pocket and inserted it into the front door lock. The squeaking sound sounded like a whimper. The door opened, revealing a dusty interior as if time had stopped. The furniture, covered with white sheets, reminded specters of people who once lived there. Clara felt a heartache when she remembered her grandfather, sitting in the armchair in front of the fireplace, telling family stories. While exploring the house, Clara found her grandfather's diary on the bookshelf. The yellow pages were full of notes and drawings, with letters that trembled as if they were written under intense pressure. There were reports of the protection of the farm, mentioning ancient rituals and a force that he said was asleep under the earth. Phrases like "the earth keeps what should not be forgotten" and "never let the shadow enter" jumped out of the pages as if they were warning it. Clara's curiosity was aroused. Why had her grandfather performed these rituals? What was he trying to protect? As he read, the sky darkened even more, and the wind began to howl from outside, making the windows creak. A shiver ran through her spine, and she decided that she needed to explore the property further. With the diary in hand, Clara went out to the yard, where the dense vegetation mixed with dry land. The farm was a maze of mysteries, and every shadow seemed to watch their movements. She went to the old barn, a place that always intrigued her in childhood. With each step, a growing sense that something was waiting for her increased her anxiety. Upon reaching the barn, Clara pushed the heavy doors. The interior was dark, light entering in thin strips through the rotten wood. And then, as if the farm itself called her, Clara began to hear a distant whisper, a familiar voice that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within herself. The clear? She froze, her heart shooting. The voice was familiar and at the same time strange, a melody of memories that pulled her into the unknown. Determined to find out the truth about her family and the farm, Clara went deeper into the barn, ready to face the secrets that awaited her. The nights at Holloway Farm became increasingly unsettling. Clara settled in her grandfather's room, surrounded by furniture that seemed to observe his actions. The diary, now his constant companion, was always by his side. Each page that turned revealed a fragment of the life of a man who, behind his serenity, carried the weight of dark secrets. As the days passed, Clara began to notice whispers that were mixed in the wind. They were subtle, almost as if the earth itself was whispering. Sometimes she thought she heard her name, Clara, floating between the trees and dense vegetation. In the quieter moments of the night, when she lay down, the feeling that something was watching her became almost unbearable. One night, Clara dreamed that she was running through an open field, but there was no light, only darkness, as if a storm was approaching. In the dream, she came across a figure shrouded in shadows, which approached slowly. The voice was familiar but unmistakably distant. "Wake up, Clara, the earth needs you." She woke up with a heart racing, the feeling that the dream was more than a simple construction of her mind. Determined to investigate further, Clara decided to visit the old corn plantation, which her grandfather always mentioned. She believed that if she could understand what had happened there, perhaps she could decipher the whispers that tormented her. As soon as he arrived, the atmosphere became dense. The corn, now dry and almost dead, seemed to form a maze around him. Clara walked between the ranks, feeling the cold in her spine. She stopped at a specific point where the ground seemed darker. Clara crouched down, looking at the earth. Something shone beneath the surface, a piece of metal, rusty and covered in mud. As she pulled it out, she found it to be a small medal, engraved with familiar-looking symbols. The diary mentioned protective charms, used by the Holloway to ensure the safety of the farm against unknown forces. With her heart in her throat, Clara realized that the medal could be one of those amulets. While examining the medal, the wind began to blow, making the corn leaves whisper. Clara raised her head and for a moment thought she saw a shadow moving between the rows. With a shiver in her spine, she decided to go home, but as she took the first step, an intense sensation made her hesitate. Something was changing in the air. That night, as he prepared to go to sleep, the whispers came back clearer than ever. "Clara." The voice seemed closer, almost beside her. She sat on the bed, her eyes wide open, listening intently. The diary in his lap began to vibrate softly, as if he was responding to the call of the earth. Not knowing what to do, Clara decided that she needed to confront this presence. She took the medal and, holding it firmly, went out into the yard. The moon illuminated the way and shadows danced in the trees. Upon reaching the edge of the field, Clara stopped, closed her eyes and called back to herself, "I am here. What do you want from me?" The silence enveloped her, but then the voice echoed again, not further away but clear and distinct. "Protect the past." A cold breeze passed through her body, and Clara realized that the earth was alive, whispering secrets of past generations, hoping she would discover them. With renewed determination, Clara felt she needed to delve deeper into the mysteries of Holloway Farm. The connection to the earth was deeper than I thought, and the answers were out there waiting for her. The days dragged in a mixture of tension and expectation. Clara felt that the Holloway Farm was calling her, as if every corner of the property held more secrets than she could imagine. The metal, now hanging around his neck, seemed to pulsate in tune with the earth, a constant reminder that there was more to discover. On a cold morning, Clara decided to explore the attic of the house. Her childhood memories came to light, reminding her how she used to play there. The spiders weaved their webs in every corner, and the light timidly entered through the small dusty windows. With a little effort, she pushed the old wooden ladder and climbed up. The attic was full of old objects, dusty boxes and covered furniture. Clara started to open the boxes, turning old photos and forgotten letters. But something led her to a dark corner where a wooden box was locked. With her heart racing, she crouched and examined the lock, which was covered with rust. Using the metal, which appeared to be shaped like a key, Clara tried to open the box. To his surprise, the box opened with a snap. Inside, he found a collection of candles, ropes, and a small book, covered in strange symbols. The title was in blurry letters, Rituals of Protection and Connection. With each page turned, Clara realized that her grandfather had not only tried to protect the farm but was also immersed in practices that could be considered hidden. The notes in vibrant red color seemed frantic, almost hurried. Do not let the darkness enter. The connection with the earth is sacred. The shadows are more than just legends. Clara's heart has pounded. It was as if the diary spoke directly to her, revealing truths she was destined to discover. Suddenly, a sound coming from the floor below made her stop. Clara was silent, listening attentively. It was as if something was moving in the house, a familiar creak that made her remember the days when her grandfather walked through the premises at night. But now he was not there. Clara came down the stairs, anxiety growing in her chest. When you got downstairs, the house was strangely quiet, but something caught your attention. The door of the room was ajar, and a soft light shone from inside. Clara pushed the door cautiously and found a lit candle on the table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The table was covered with objects she recognized from the diary, a ceramic bowl, stones, and dried herbs. Clara felt a wave of panic mixed with determination. Someone or something was trying to communicate with her, and the farm was shrouded in a deep mystery that she needed to unravel. It's time to understand what's going on, he thought. She took the diary and objects from the table, feeling the connection with her ancestry and the responsibility that it brought. With the candles lit and the ingredients at her disposal, Clara decided that she would perform a ritual that her grandfather had described to try to establish a connection with the earth and discover the truth about the presence that followed her. With the light of candles casting shadows around her, Clara began to follow the instructions in the diary, reciting words in a language she did not fully understand, but that seemed to resonate in her heart. As the words came out of his lips, the temperature in the room began to drop, and a cold breeze seemed to cross the space. Then the whisper came back, stronger than ever, filling the air around her. Clara? The voice called her, and Clara felt that she was getting closer to the truth. The land, the house, and her ancestors were all interconnected, and she was the key to uncovering the mysteries that had been buried for so long. That night, Clara slept with the diary by her side and the metal hanging around her neck as a shield against the darkness surrounding her. However, rest did not come easily. The whispers intensified, penetrating their dreams, bringing vivid images of ancient faces and dancing shadows. She saw herself in a field at night, surrounded by indistinct figures, all watching her with gloomy and hopeful looks. When she woke up, Clara was wet with sweat, the morning light filtering through the windows. The weather was heavy, as if a storm were approaching, and the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. The weight of the events of the last few nights began to accumulate, and she felt that she was on the verge of something that would change her life forever. Determined, Clara decided she needed to confront what followed her. Going out to the yard, she walked to the cornfield where she had found the metal. The sky was cloudy, and the sparse light created a surreal environment. As she entered the field, a shiver ran through her body, and a feeling of being watched took hold of her. Clear? The voice whispered again, now clearer, as if it were coming from within the earth. The wind lifted the corn grains, and Clara realized that the answer was there, waiting for her to approach. With her heart racing, she began to walk through the field, following the direction of the voice. As she advanced, Clara noticed that the corn seemed to open before her, forming a path. The sun began to shine through the clouds, and the temperature rose slightly. But as it approached the center of the field, the light disappeared, and the air became heavy. Clara stopped, breathing heavily, feeling the presence closer than ever. It was as if the field was alive, pulsating under her feet. A shadow formed before her, taking an indistinct but clearly human form. Clara felt the fear take hold of her, but something inside prevented her from retreating. The figure seemed to have a familiar countenance, though distorted by darkness. "You shouldn't be here," said the figure, the voice echoing in Clara's mind. It was her grandfather's voice, but there was a touch of sadness that made her feel a squeeze in the heart. "What you seek can be dangerous." "I need to understand," Clara replied, her voice steady though trembling. "The farm, the land, everything is connected. What happened here? What were you trying to protect?" The figure hesitated, and Claire saw the shadow writhing. "The earth carries the weight of ancient secrets, and now you must decide whether to face them or run away. The choice is yours, Clara." With every word, Clara felt her connection to the farm deepened. The field, the house, the rituals. It was all part of a larger whole, and she was at the center of it. But what did it mean to face the secrets? What would she have to sacrifice? "I'm not afraid," Clara declared, her voice echoing with renewed determination. "I am ready to face what comes next." Then the figure began to disappear, dissolving into shadows that mixed with corn. "The truth is buried under her feet," she whispered as the wind rose around Clara. "Darkness is coming, and you must be ready." With this, the figure disappeared completely, leaving Clara alone in the field. The wind enveloped her, and she realized that the shadows were gathering around her, and the feeling of being watched was again squeezing her chest. Whatever was lurking at the Holloway farm was approaching, and Clara knew she couldn't ignore it. Determined to find out the truth, she decided to go home and prepare for what was coming. He knew that the connection with the land was stronger than he had imagined, and that the fate of the Holloway farm was in his hands. The following days were marked by a growing restlessness. Clara could not get away from the words of the figure who turns in the field. "The truth is buried beneath your feet." The phrase echoed in your mind, becoming a mantra that guided you in your quest for understanding. With each hour that passed, the weight of the secrets of the Holloway farm increased, as did the sense of urgency. Determined to unearth the truth, Clara revisited her grandfather's diary and ritual book. With the objects she had collected from the attic and the living room, she began to prepare for a new ritual, something that would allow her to go further in her connection with the earth. But this time she wanted a direct contact, a revelation. She could not back down anymore. On a starless night, Clara settled in the backyard, far from the shadows that seemed to lurk. The sky was heavy and the storm seemed imminent. The ritual required concentration and intention. With a candle lit in front of her and the ingredients carefully arranged, Clara began to recite the words that her grandfather had written down. The wind began to blow more strongly, and the temperature dropped abruptly. The feeling that something was about to happen involved Clara, and she felt her energy intensify. "I seek the truth," she declared, her voice steady. "May the earth reveal what is hidden." As soon as the words left his lips, the earth under his feet began to vibrate. Clara felt a wave of power go through her body, and the light of the candle swung as if an invisible presence was around her. Then a deep trembling reverberated, and the ground in front of him began to open. With a bang, the earth broke, revealing a deep pit. Clara hesitated, fear and curiosity fighting inside her. But the need to know the truth was stronger. She approached the opening, the walls of clay and stone seeming to breathe. The shadows danced around you, and the familiar voice echoed again, but now it was not just a whisper. "Come on, Clara. It's time to know." Carefully descending, Clara came across an underground space that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The walls were adorned with old inscriptions and markings, and in the center, a small wooden ark rested. The air was heavy, full of untold stories. With her breath taken, Clara approached the ark and opened it. Inside, he found a collection of objects: letters, amulets, old photos, and a small notebook that belonged to his grandmother. His grandmother's words, written in delicate calligraphy, told the story of the Holloway family and how the farm was built on sacred ground. "This land is not just ours," she had written. "It is the keeper of secrets that go back generations. The darkness that is coming is not just a legend, it's real. What we do with this legacy will determine our future." The truth fell upon Claire as a burden. The protective rituals were not just precautions, they were a response to a force that had been awakened. What his grandmother was trying to protect, what his grandfather had kept so carefully, now was on the verge of revealing. As Clara leafed through the notebook, the words began to come to life. The ground began to shake again, and his grandmother's voice echoed, "What is buried cannot remain hidden forever. You must be prepared, Clara. The darkness is coming and the farm needs you. Panic invaded her, but also a renewed determination. Clara knew that Holloway Farm needed her, and the choice between ignoring the truth or facing it was already taken. With the objects of the Ark in her hands and the courage that sprang from within, she prepared for what came next. It was time to confront the darkness that had been unleashed, and Clara was ready to discover her role in the Holloway family's legacy. Clara came out of the underground tomb with the objects in her hands, the sense of urgency growing inside her. Whatever was approaching the Holloway farm was not just an echo of the past. It was a palpable force that threatened everything he loved. The words of his grandmother reverberated in his mind, and the shadow that followed it became more real every moment. Determined to face this force, Clara decided to prepare a final ritual. With the Ark and the objects of the grave, she went to the field where it all began, the place where the metal had called her. The storm was approaching, the winds howling as if the earth itself was preparing for a confrontation. With the sky getting darker and lightning lighting the night, Clara arranged the space, creating a circle with the stones and amulets she brought. The air was electrified, and she felt the presence coming closer, as if the Holloway farm itself was in tune with her call. "Come if you have the courage," Clara challenged, her voice firm in spite of the fear that enveloped her. "I will not run away." The winds increased and shadows began to form in the field. Clara saw the dancing figures coming together, amalgamating into a presence that made her heart race. The figure of his grandfather materialized in front of him, sad and worried look. "Clara, you mustn't do that," he said, his voice echoing deep amid the storm. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know what's at stake," Clara replied, determination burning in her eyes. "This land is my inheritance, and I cannot let it succumb to darkness." The wind blew with strength, and Clara felt the ground tremble. The dark presence intensified, and she realized that she was not only fighting a shadow of the past, but a force that wanted to consume everything that was dear to her. The shadows began to shake, forming an indistinct mass, threatening. "You can't stop what's already moving," whispered a voice that sounded like 1,000 echoes. It was the voice of darkness, and it was filled with anger and despair. "The earth will always belong to me." Clara closed her eyes and concentrated her energy. Memories of her grandmother, of her childhood on the farm, of laughter and care came to light. "No, you cannot have this land. It belongs to life, to hope. I am the guardian now, and I will not allow you to take that away from me." With a powerful cry, Clara raised her arms and began to recite the words of the ritual, calling out to the ancestral force of the earth. The shadows hesitated, and the figure of the grandfather advanced, his countenance changing to a supportive look. "Use what you've learned," he encouraged her. "The connection to the earth is stronger than you think." The storm has increased, and Clara felt the energy of the farm flow through it. The words of his grandmother, the lessons of his grandfather, all united in one purpose. She was fighting not only for the farm, but for all the generations that had passed by there, for life that pulsed under the surface. The shadows began to retreat, the darkness dissipating before the light that Clara invoked. The field, once full of threats, now shone with an aura of protection. Clara felt the presence of her ancestors by her side, strengthening her, and then in a last act of resistance she cried out, "This land is mine, and I will not let you destroy it." With that, a wave of energy exploded from Clara, illuminating the field with a radiant light. The shadows were swallowed, and a distant cry echoed in the air, as if the very darkness was fading away. When the light faded, Clara fell to her knees, exhausted, but feeling a peace she had never known before. The field was silent, and the storm finally calmed down as if the farm was breathing relieved. The figure of his grandfather appeared again, smiling proudly. "You did the right thing, Clara. Now Holloway Farm can prosper again." With a smile on her lips, Clara looked around. The plants seemed to vibrate with life, and the sky began to clear. She knew the battle was won, but the war for the protection of the farm and her inheritance would continue. Now, however, she was not alone. With the medal around her neck and the diary in hand, Clara felt that her place in the history of Holloway Farm was finally secured. The future was uncertain, but she was ready to face it. The sun was not yet born when David woke up, as he did every day, to the sound of birds singing and the rustling of leaves. The farm, a legacy of his father, was a vast farmland with cornfields stretching as far as the eye could see. But unlike previous years, this day began with a weight on the chest. David sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his eyes, trying to drive away the fatigue that was accumulating. The nights had become long and restless. Since spring had begun, he had noticed a strange change in the farm. The whispers that were once a quiet memory now were a disturbing echo that followed him. As he left the house, he felt the freshness of the morning air, but something was wrong. A cold breeze swept across the field like a warning. He shook his head, trying to get the thought out. The work in the field was waiting for him, and routine should be his comfort. During the day, he took care of the crops and fed the animals, but the feeling of being observed accompanied him. In the afternoon, as he drove his tractor through the fields, he saw something moving between the trees. A fast shadow, almost imperceptible. David hesitated but decided to ignore. "It's just my mind playing tricks," he thought. The isolation had its effects, but he was determined to keep focus. When night came, the farm became a completely different place. The sky was covered with stars, but the beauty of the night could not dispel the anxiety that settled in his heart. The silence became oppressive, and the whispers that were soft before now seemed to resonate in the shadows. He tried to calm down, but the memories of something deeper, older, began to seep into his thoughts. Sitting at the table during dinner, David looked out of the window, gazing at the fields lit by the moon. It was then that he heard him again, a whisper. This time it seemed clearer, almost like a call. He stood up and walked to the front door, facing the darkness. "It's just the wind," he repeated to himself, but a part of him knew it wasn't. Something was out there waiting. And as the cold settled in his bones, David felt that the farm, which had been his home, now became a place filled with dark secrets. The first evening of autumn arrived, and with it the awareness that the days of peace were numbered. David hardly knew that what awaited him would be much more than a simple shadow in the trees. It was something that defied logic and reality, and was about to change your life forever. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere of the farm became increasingly charged. David tried to concentrate on work, but the feeling that something was watching him never left him. He felt the presence in every corner, in every whisper of the wind, but more than that, he began to notice that something was changing around him. The nights were especially disturbing. On one of these mornings, when the sky was darker than ever, David was woken by a noise coming from the stable. The sound was as if something was hitting the walls, an irregular beat that took him out of deep sleep. With the lantern in hand, he decided to investigate. His heart was beating in his ears as he walked through the darkness. As he entered the stable, the dim light of the lantern illuminated the bales of hay and the tools that were piled up. Everything seemed in order, but at the bottom he noticed that one of the doors was ajar. Something had passed through there. Perhaps some animal, he thought, but doubt consumed him. The darkness seemed to swallow space, and silence was deeper than ever. David closed the door, convinced that it was only his imagination. However, as he returned home, a quick shadow crossed his path. He froze, paralyzed by fear. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the feeling of being observed returned with full force. The next morning, David found strange marks in the land around the farm. They were deep grooves, as if something had dragged something heavy on the ground. He crouched down to examine, but soon moved away, a shiver running down his spine. Every day the plants seemed to wither, the animals were restless, and David began to question whether he was still in his right mind. On a particularly distressing night, as he was trying to sleep, he heard whispers that seemed to float through the open window. "David?" The name sounded softly, but the tone was far from friendly. It was a call, but also a warning. The voice dissolved in darkness, but fear took root in his chest. Determined to understand what was happening, he began to research the history of the farm. He spent hours in the city library, going through old newspapers and records that led him to discover a tragic accident that had occurred decades ago. A group of workers who had been hired to plow the land had disappeared, and many believed that their souls still roamed there, seeking peace. With his mind full of uncertainty and soul in distress, David returned home that night. The wind howled through the trees, and the whispers seemed more intense, as if they were accumulating, ready to reveal themselves. He remembered the story of the lost workers and wondered if it was just a legend, or if in fact there was something deeper and darker in the heart of that land. With each passing day, David felt that what was chasing him was not just a shadow, but a presence he wanted to manifest. He prepared to confront the unknown, aware that truth, however terrifying it was, needed to be discovered. The anxiety that consumed David did not leave him alone. During the day he tried to be distracted by work, but the nights became more and more intense. An urgent need to find out the truth pushed him to investigate the history of the farm, as if this could somehow free him from the feeling of being persecuted. On a sunny afternoon, he decided to visit the city library again. Sat down at a dusty table and began to browse the old records he had found. Among yellow pages and reports of events that seemed to belong to a distant past, a story stood out: the tragic death of a group of workers who years ago had been hired to brave the forest that surrounded his farm. The reports were vague, but some mentioned a mysterious accident that had occurred on the night of a lunar eclipse. The men disappeared without a trace, and rumors began to circulate in the city about the land being cursed. David frowned, feeling the weight of those words. What had happened that night still echoed among the older residents, who avoided talking about it. As he flipped through the pages, David found an old photo of the workers. One of them, a man with dark hair and deep gaze, seemed to have an expression that reflected immense pain. The man looked at him in a way that made him feel cold in his spine. His name was written on the side, Thomas Reed. There was something in that image that seemed familiar, a strange connection that David could not understand. Determined to find out more about Thomas and the other men, David asked the librarian for help, an old acquaintance who had always been a source of stories about the city. The man with a serious look warned David, "The story of that farm is not to be unearthed. Some things are better when left in the past." But the warning only increased David's resolve. With the help of the librarian, he began to investigate the birth and death records of the city, seeking any information that could clarify the mystery. As the days passed, a connection began to form in his mind. Thomas was not just a name. He was someone who had been related to David's family, though he did not know exactly how. One night, while reviewing the documents at his home, an idea occurred to him. What if Thomas had left something behind? He decided that he needed to visit the old Reed house, a building on the edge of the forest where whispers seemed to be strongest. With the lantern in his hand and a beating heart, David set out for the house, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. The house was in ruins, but upon entering, David felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with terror. The air was heavy and silence was deafening. He began to explore the rooms, each filled with dusty furniture and memories of a forgotten time. In one of the rooms he found an old box covered with cobwebs. Inside were letters and photos that revealed the Reeds' lives, their hopes, dreams, and most importantly the tragedy that had separated their lives. As he read the letters, a feeling of distress overtook David. One of the letters talked about a ritual that the workers had planned to perform during the eclipse, a means of ensuring that the earth was favorable to them. But something went wrong, and what was supposed to be a celebration became a curse. Then the lantern started to flash, and David heard the whisper again, louder than ever. "David?" The voice was a mixture of pain and despair. He felt the ground tremble under his feet and in a moment of panic ran out of the house. The fresh night air enveloped him, but he knew that there was no turning back now. Something was coming, and David needed to find out the truth before it was too late. The night was particularly dark when David left the Reed's house. The cold seemed to have penetrated his bones, and the feeling of being observed increased with each step towards the farm. He knew that the discovery of truth had brought him to a point of no return. Those whispers were not just echoes of the past. They were a desperate call for him to face what was hidden in the shadows of his land. As I walked back, the wind howled through the trees, creating a sinister melody. When he arrived at the farm, the full moon lit up the field with a silver glow, and David was drawn by an inexplicable urge to return to where it all began, the circle of trees, where he had first felt the presence. Arriving at the site, David stopped, panting, and looked around. The whisper was louder now, almost like a song of lament, a call that seemed to come from under the earth. He lit the lantern and, as it illuminated the ground, noticed that the ground was shaking, as if something was moving below. With the courage that remained, he began to dig with his hands, tearing up the cold and hard earth. The whispers became louder, and David felt a shiver run through his spine. "Thomas, is that you?" he called, his voice almost lost in the darkness. The answer came in the form of a strong wind that made the trees swing, almost as if they were answering your question. As he dug, his hands found something solid. With a tug, he brought to light an ancient shrine, covered in dirt and moss. The object seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and hesitantly David opened the reliquary. Inside, he found an amulet that gleamed under the light of the lantern. It was a symbol he recognized from his research, a protective mark that workers had worn before the ritual. At that moment, the air around him changed. The presence became palpable, and David turned to face the spectral figure of Thomas Reed. The man had an expression of pain and anger, and his eyes, though empty, seemed to penetrate into David's soul. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, voice echoing like an echo in the trees. "We're stuck. You brought the curse back." David swallowed it. I just wanted to understand. What happened that night? How can I help you?" Thomas took a step forward, and the wind increased, almost as if nature were joining with spirit. "The ritual was not completed. The earth demands sacrifice, but the essence of those who died cannot be released without you completing what we have not achieved. David's heart shot. He had read about purification rituals, but was not sure if he could perform them. What do I need to do? Return to the crash site. Find the others, they are waiting. Only you can break the curse. With the words of Thomas echoing in his mind, David knew he could not back down. He needed to face not only the ghosts of the past, but also his own fears that haunted him. I will do whatever it takes, he promised. The figure of Thomas began to dissipate, but before it disappeared completely, he whispered, "Remember, the earth has eyes. Believe what you cannot see." And with that, the presence faded away, leaving David alone under the moonlight. Feeling the adrenaline rushing in his veins, he knew that the next stage of his journey was just beginning. With the reliquary in hand, he decided that the next morning he would return to the accident site, determined to find out what had really happened on that fateful night and free the trapped souls who tormented his farm. The sun rose timidly the next morning, filtering its rays through the heavy clouds that hovered over the farm. David felt a renewed determination, but also a palpable fear. He knew that what he was about to do could change everything, not only for him, but also for the souls who had been wandering so long without rest. With the reliquary carefully kept in his pocket, David set out for the forest. The path was familiar, but as you approached the crash site, the feeling of discomfort increased. The trees seemed denser, and the air carried a weight that made him hesitate at every step. The stories he had heard about the eclipse and the ritual began to intertwine in his mind, and he felt that the past was about to manifest itself in a dark way. Upon arriving at the site, David stopped and watched. The area was covered with vegetation, but he managed to identify some signs of the ancient construction that had existed there. The ground still looked marked, as if the scars of tragedy had never healed. With a deep sigh, he crouched and began to dig the earth again. The dry leaves and cold earth accumulated in his hands, while the memory of the letters he had read mixed with the feeling of being observed. The air became denser and an inexplicable cold enveloped his body. It was as if the earth itself were reacting to their effort, crying for deliverance. After a few minutes of work, his hands found something solid. It was a wooden box, worn by time and covered with moss. Carefully he removed it and opened it, revealing old objects that belonged to the workers: tools, photos, and a diary. The sense of reverence took hold of him. These were the traces of those men's lives, and now they were again in the daylight. He began to leaf through the diary, its yellow pages telling stories about dreams and plans that never came true. But, amid the reports of life, he found a passage that caught his attention. "We are about to perform a ritual that will grant us the protection the land needs. We know there is a price to pay, but we are ready. The eclipse is our chance." The words reverberated in his mind, and David realized that the protection they sought was a sacrifice. But what kind? He felt that he was approaching a truth that could be both liberating and devastating. As I reflected on this, the sky began to darken. The clouds, once shy, now crowded together, and a shadow covered the place. David looked up and saw that an eclipse was about to occur. A chill ran through his body. The moment was approaching. He needed to act fast. With the reliquary in hand, he began to draw symbols on the ground, trying to recreate what he had read in the cards. With each line he drew, the whispers increased, becoming a chorus of voices crying for deliverance. He felt the souls were gathering, watching him with hope. Then, in a moment of clarity, David stopped and said aloud, "I set you free. If the earth demands a sacrifice, let me be the one to pay the price. I will not let their souls remain trapped here." The light of the eclipse began to cover the sky, and the wind increased around it, as if nature itself were responding to its call. David felt a power forming, an energy pulsing between him and the earth. And then, the whisper of Thomas echoed in his mind, "Believe what you cannot see." David closed his eyes, concentrating on the intentions he had put into the ritual. He felt the presence of souls around him, a warm and comforting. The environment became electrically charged, and suddenly a bright light burst out around it, obfuscating everything in its sight. As the light faded, David fell to his knees, exhausted. The eclipse had passed, but something had changed. He felt a wave of peace invade the place, and the voices that once cried now were silent. The feeling of being watched had dissipated, and the forest seemed to breathe again. He stood up slowly, looking around. The land was quiet, and for the first time in weeks he felt that the farm could finally rest in peace. David knew the curse had been broken, but the cost still weighed on his heart. The souls of the workers were now free, but he knew that the memories of that journey would accompany him forever. With a final look at the place, he turned and walked back to the farm, determined to honor the memory of those men, knowing that although they had found freedom, the history of the farm would never be forgotten. The following weeks brought unexpected peace to David. The atmosphere of the farm had changed drastically since the ritual. The air was lighter, and the plants were blooming like never before. He felt renewed, as if the weight that had been on him for so long had finally been relieved. While he was working on the field, he began to hear the birds singing again, their joyful voices breaking the silence that once hovered over the property. The nights were quiet, and dreams that were full of shadows now became sources of inspiration. David began to write down his experiences in a notebook, deciding that it was time to share the farm's story, the real story, with the world. One afternoon, while walking through the forest surrounding the property, he found a group of children playing in the shade of trees. They laughed and ran, unconcerned, and something inside David stilled at seeing them. He remembered the pain and despair that once surrounded the place. Now, childhood and joy seemed to finally claim that space, and he smiled when he realized that, in a way, he was doing his part for the legacy of the workers to be respected. Determined to honor the memory of Thomas Reed and his companions, David organized a small ceremony at the farm, inviting townspeople and friends to share stories about what had happened. He spoke openly about the legends, the whispers, and especially about the importance of facing the past to find peace. That night, under a starry sky, they all gathered around a fire. The children sat close by, listening intently as David told of the workers' sacrifice and how he had found the reliquary that connected them to the past. The voices of the adults murmured in agreement, and the light of the bonfire seemed to bring the story to life. At the end of the ceremony, David felt light, as if a new era was beginning not only for him but for the whole community. He realized that the story of the farm was not only his, but everyone who lived there. And by sharing it, he had created a space for collective healing. As the months went by, the farm became a symbol of renewal. David planted a garden in honor of the workers, where colorful flowers sprouted every season, reminding everyone about the importance of respecting the land and its stories. He went on to receive visitors and share not only the beauty of nature but also the lessons learned from echoes of the past. And though David never forgot the fear that haunted him, he now knew that fear had brought him to a place of understanding and acceptance. The shadows that once dominated his life were replaced by light, and the whispers of souls who once wandered aimlessly turned into a soft song of gratitude. At the heart of the farm, David felt he had finally found his place. He was not just a farmer, he was a keeper of stories, a link between the past and the present, and determined to ensure that the voices of the past were never forgotten. And so the farm rose as a beacon of hope and freedom, where the memory of those who had left blended with the vibrant life that flourished there. David looked at the horizon where the sun was setting, aware that although the past might be dark, the future was full of possibilities.